If you have a Bible, you can turn to 1 Peter. We're going to be serving a few different verses in 1 Peter because today we are concluding our 1 Peter sermon series. I've been preaching this letter since October 2nd. Of course, we took a break during Advent and at the New Year. But basically, since October, this is what our church has been digesting as a corporate body. So I want to begin by reading verses 12 through 14, and then we'll summarize some of the main ideas we've seen in 1 Peter. Peter says, in the closing of this letter, by Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Greet one another with the kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Christ. May God give us eyes to see and ears to hear what he has for us in his word. You know, I really hope that the sermons I preach affect you. I really hope they do. I'm aware that sometimes they don't, and I'm aware that in some churches, the sermons are the boring part of the service. They're the part that you're looking at. How much longer is that guy going to go? I hope that's not true here. I really hope that, we're eager for this moment, that we anticipate what's going to happen through this moment. Because let's take the Bible serious. God could use whatever means he wants to use to transform us. But what is one of the major ways he transforms us in the Bible? It's through preaching. The New Testament church, they gathered for prayer and fellowship and to hear the word of God preached. That is the means God chose to use. So this is a powerful moment. As all of you sit and listen and submit yourselves to what I'm saying, this is a powerful moment. Not necessarily because I'm powerful or because I'm strong in this moment, but it's powerful because this is the Word of God. And we are God's people. And I am your pastor. So I stand before you as God's man at God's time with God's Word in God's family. So powerful stuff should be happening. It really should be, even though we're preaching for 45 minutes, and YouTube and TikTok have trained us to have the attention spans of 3 seconds. I get it. Nonetheless, this should be a unique moment in your calendar for transformation. So I've been thinking about that. What do I do so that I could partner with God in your sanctification? So that you love God more deeply, you know him more fully. What could I be doing? And one of the things that I've been incorporating into my pastoral ministry is when we finish a book, I spend a sermon and we review it. What are some truths that we can consolidate together and take with us as we leave 1 Peter? So I've been doing this for several sermons now. Some of you might remember I preached Genesis. It was one of the first sermons I preached to you. And my hope in that sermon series was that you would be comforted as you saw the gospel in new ways. Over and over again, we saw the gospel in the book of Genesis. Moses constructed Genesis and gave us certain historical stories in Genesis to highlight two major ideas. Humanity is faithless, but God is faithful. Over and over and over again. And the idea in Genesis is that God is faithful to his word and his people despite his people. I'm hoping that's a truth you're clinging to, even 2 years removed from our sermon series in Genesis. That God is faithful to his people despite his people. I hope that comforted you as you saw the gospel in new ways. Ephesians. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, I preached through Ephesians. And I really hope we were moved to good works through the book of Ephesians, as we realized more deeply that we are outcasts, that we are far from God, children of the devil, under God's wrath. But because of the gospel, we have been brought near. No longer aliens to God, but his people. No longer under wrath, but under God's love. Like, I hope we would have been moved to good works in new ways as we understood those truths. Zechariah, we preached that about a little over a year ago. Like, Zechariah was such an important book that was made. Zechariah prophesied the words. He wrote the letters to comfort a discouraged people. Like, in the book of Zechariah, God's people are super discouraged. They have social problems, economic problems, political problems, and they deserve it. They deserve all of it. Like, they're suffering because they sinned. But what we see in the book of Zechariah is that the people's future will no longer be defined by their past sin, but their future will be defined by God's grace. And the purpose of Zechariah was to give the people confidence that God got this. Right? So, like, I hope in a new way, like, you guys are more confident people in God because of Zechariah. I hope in the book of Matthew that, again, we were emboldened. Like, Matthew was so important because what Matthew did in his gospel is he showed how Jesus is the true Israel of God's people. So it begins with Jesus fulfilled this, and Jesus fulfilled this, and Jesus fulfilled this, and Jesus fulfilled this. And Jesus is rewriting the history of Israel. So in the Old Testament, you see Israel fail, 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 fail. It's constant, right? But Jesus is reliving that history and succeeding where Israel failed. And the purpose of that is to embolden us that Jesus has rewritten our history. As we've been preaching missional fatherhood and missional motherhood, I hope that you all would be equipped to mother and father in ways that are missional instead of worldly. Like, that's why I'm preaching these sermons, right? Like, there's tangible effects that I want to have in your life in these moments. So we're at the end of 1 Peter. I just read the closing. And Peter wrote this letter and the next letter, and I'm going to preach 2 Peter next. And then I'll be gone for several weeks in July, and you'll have some guest preachers, and then we'll do Lamentations. So 2 Peter is next, but Peter wrote 1 Peter and 2 Peter so that we would be holy and godly as we wait for the second coming. Like, Peter actually tells us this in 1 Peter chapter 3. Like, he wrote these two letters so that we would be holy, which means devoted to God, and godly, which means being like Christ as we wait for the second coming. So I'm hoping and I'm praying that as you leave today, after the service and Sunday school and the business meeting and evangelism training, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to guilt you like that. That was kind of manipulative, wasn't it? I'm sorry. I'm hoping as you leave today, whenever the Lord leads you to leave, that you would leave actually more holy and actually more godly than October 2nd when we began this sermon series. That's my hope. Because Peter wrote this so that the people would be more holy and be more godly. So, did I succeed? How do I measure my success? I measure how successful I was completely and entirely and utterly based on how holy you now are and how godly you now are. So let's think about a reflection question that we could think about at the beginning of the sermon, and we will return to it at the end of the sermon. What change has or should happen in your life because of this sermon series? Write it down. Take a picture with your phone. Take a mental note. Perhaps, even without this sermon, like you've thought about this truth. And you could say, this is how I've been changed. I know it. You could point to the truth and the change in your life. Maybe you have already been changed. I hope for many of you have. But maybe you need this moment, a moment of consolidating these truths and encouraging one another. Maybe you need this moment so that this sermon series can change you. So think about that truth. I'm actually going to give you a few seconds in silence, and then we'll think about 5 truths that we've learned in 1 Peter. Okay, 5 truths that I want to highlight now that we're at the end of 1 Peter. The first truth that Peter has highlighted over and over and over again in this book is that we belong to God. This is an issue of identity, an issue of who are you? Who are you? Peter has described and answered this question in many ways, and overall, I think what he's saying is that we belong to God. We do not belong to this world. Peter began the entire book by saying, to the elect exiles. He's addressing churches in modern-day Turkey at the turn of the era in about 60 A.D., mostly Gentile churches, and he says, you do not belong to this world any longer. You are exiles. In chapter 2, verse 11, he says you are strangers, you are sojourners, you are pilgrims, you are aliens. This is not your world. Although you were born into this world, you have been born again. And you have forsaken your earthly inheritance in chapter 1 for a future heavenly inheritance. Like, who are you? You do not belong to this world. This world does not treat us as their family. We've seen in the book of 1 Peter that this world relates to Christians with reviling, cursing, maligning. This world hates you. This world wants to hurt you because we're not their family. We're actually their enemy. This world has gone to war against us, and we need to realize we do not belong to this world. Rather, we belong to God. Like, if you are to be holy and godly, if you are to leave this church building more holy and godly than when you came, you need to think properly about who you are. You belong to God. And to highlight that truth, I want us to think about chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. We memorized this verse, or these 2 verses, several months ago, so many of you should be able to recite them. I kind of mess up a little bit. I often say that you may proclaim or declare, I get it all mixed up, but let's just read it together. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. These verses reflect on who we are. You are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation, a people for his own possession. You are God's people. You are a people who's received mercy. This is who you are. And let's not be confused. Peter here is quoting Exodus 19 and Hosea chapter 1, 2 passages that talk about Israel's identity. There's no way to get around that. And this is such an important point. What Peter is doing is he is writing to churches that are mostly Gentile in Turkey, and they're asking important questions. You see, we're asking important questions today, are we not? Does God have an authoritative word on gender? Is God better than material possessions? What does it mean to be human? Can artificial intelligence advance in such a way that it surpasses humanity? Like, we are asking important questions now, and the early church asked important questions also. One of the most important questions they asked is, do Gentiles who come to know Jesus have to become Jews to be truly saved? That's what they asked. Because the Bible talks about circumcision and celebrating the Sabbath and all of these kinds of things. And there was a group of Jews who were saying, you Gentiles, you white people and you black people and you Mexican people, if you are truly going to be saved, you have to become a Jew culturally. Think about that. If that's true, that could be quite painful. It means you can't wear certain clothes and you can't eat certain foods and you have to be circumcised, and it means the whole Old Testament law is authoritative. So actually the first church council, you have Nicaea and Chalcedon and others as well, is described in Acts 15. And it's over this very issue. The early church leaders come together and they're debating and asking, do Gentiles who get saved also have to be circumcised? And the word is no. God's salvation does not depend on these Israelite rituals and ceremonies and good things. They're no longer relevant. So what happened after Acts 15 is Paul took this message and he went to a lot of churches and told them, to be truly saved, you just have to trust in Jesus. You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to keep a to-do list. You don't have to become a Jew. All you have to do is trust in Jesus. And guess what? Do you know where Paul took that letter in Acts 16? To the same churches Peter is writing to. That's so important because the churches Peter is writing to, they didn't have the New Testament like we did. You know what was their scriptures? It was the Old Testament and maybe a few other letters. That's it. It wasn't like what we have. So when they gathered for church and they read the Old Testament, you know what they read about? How you have to be circumcised. And about how Gentiles were getting their heads chopped off and called dogs. And these Gentile Christians are like, that was my great-grandpa. That's what they were thinking. They were asking, do I belong here? Is the gospel for me? Because I am not an ethnic Jew. And what does Peter do? He takes the identity of Israel and he applies it to the church, saying, you belong to God. You are God's people. You are not second-class citizens any longer. You are God's people. Despite where you were born, despite who your mommy and daddy were, you are God's chosen people. Those who have faith in Jesus are the offspring of Abraham. That's Peter's point. And theologically, that's so significant. Because if we are to make it, and if we are going to persevere amid present suffering, we need to understand deeply we are God's people. The Old Testament is our book. This is our history because we are in Christ. We are God's people. If we're going to make it, we need to know who we are. And the answer is we belong to God, truly and completely. The second idea that I think Peter focuses on throughout this letter is our mission. So first, it's an issue of identity. Who are we? We belong to God. Second, what are we to do? Who are we? And what is our job? And I think what Peter says is we were saved to spread the glory of God. You have a mission. You have a purpose. So important. We're craving purpose. If you lose your purpose, you don't work properly, right? I mean, you have an air compressor that never pumps up tires, it's going to break eventually. You have a lawnmower that's not mowing lawns, it's not flourishing, right? It's not working. Like, you have a purpose. Like, there is something you're supposed to live your life for. You were designed for a mission. And the mission is to spread the glory of God. It's not to spread your own glory. It's not to be comfortable. It's not to be liked. It's not to be culturally relevant. It's not to live a happy life. Like if you make any one of those things your purpose, it's like fueling a lawnmower with water. It will not work, right? In fact, it will break. Like you have a purpose. You have something that you're supposed to live your life for. And it's spreading the glory of God. So going back to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 through 10, Peter identifies our mission, saying we are to proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. I want to point out a few things here. Notice in these verses, so let's keep them up, guys, we see Peter bring together identity and vocation, or identity and mission. So see it again. You are, that's identity. You are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You are a people for his own possession. Now look, that you may proclaim, that's mission. Do you see that? Peter is bringing together identity and mission. And what he shows us here is something so crucial. Mission, evangelism, persevering amid your pain depends on identity. We could put it this way. We do the things we do because of who we are. The doing depends on the being. And if you mix those up, the consequences will be devastating. We don't do things so that we might become. It doesn't say, proclaim the gospel so that you might be a chosen race. Does it say that? It doesn't say, proclaim the gospel so that you might be God's people. Does it say that? It doesn't. It says, you are God's people. If you've trusted in Jesus, if you've said he's my only hope for salvation, then you are God's people. And the result and purpose of that is that you might live on mission. We can't confuse these things. Identity comes before mission. But notice this. It's our identity that moves us to mission. So we have to understand the foundation is, right? It's not mission. The foundation is identity. That's what moves you to proclaim. But notice, that's what it does. Your identity moves you to mission. And isn't this the nature of excellent things? Like when you experience excellent things, what do? Like honestly, like just think about the last time you experienced something super excellent, right? A baby's born, you're getting married, a grandson is born or a granddaughter, somebody comes to know Jesus. You had a really good dish of guacamole. Like what do? You talk about it, right? Now what do? You put it on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. Like that's what you do. You share it. That's how God designed excellent things. Like you have the best pizza in the world and you talk about it. You write a Google review. You come here and you have a great time at church for the first time, you put it on Yelp. This is a fantastic church, right? When you experience excellent things, you just talk about it. It's when you experience boring things and mundane things that you don't talk about it. Think about your life. When you're gathering with your family, every family has what we call soundtracks. They're things that you repeat and you repeat and you repeat. Like, you know when you're going to get together for Thanksgiving, you're going to talk about 2 or 3 things. And it's the same every Christmas, right? And what are those things you talk about? They're not the so-so things in life. They're the memorable things in life. Sometimes they're really sad things. Sometimes they're really exciting things. But they're memorable things. What about you? When you think about your life 10 years ago and 5 years ago, what are the things you remember? They're not the so-so things in life. They're those big, transformative things in life. So notice, what do people naturally do with excellent things and highly transformative things, they talk about him. Like, the purpose of new birth is evangelism. Like, God saved you so that you might proclaim. Because it's excellent. I mean, look at verse 9 again and verse 10. Like, what is happening when your identity is shift from not my people to my people? You have not received mercy, and now you have received mercy. Like, God is calling you out of darkness into light. You were blind, and now you see. You were dead, and now you are alive. You are lonely, and now you have community. You were burdened by your guilt and the condemnation of your sin, and now you have freedom in Christ. Is that not excellent? Like, isn't it excellent that you are going to spend forever with God? You're not going to go to hell. If you trust in Jesus, like Jesus is your king, you are not going to go to hell. You're going to go to heaven and spend forever with God. Is that not excellent? Isn't it? Is it not excellent? So we talk about it. That's what we do. So do you see, evangelism isn't like it's like out of step with who you are. So when I come up, I'm like, hey, we're having evangelism training. It's like, what? Like, I'm not talking about something peripheral to who you are or something now unnatural to who you are as a Christian. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm saying this is what you are naturally recreated to do. Proclaim. You were made and you were saved to proclaim the excellencies of God. God oriented, if we could use this image, God has oriented your new birth tongue and your new birth throat and vocal cords to proclaim his excellencies. Like, our identity is tied to our mission. And I've already said it, but this is our purpose. Like, God saved you to proclaim. That's a purpose clause. That you may proclaim. Like, why did God save you? Sometimes we sing songs that aren't completely accurate, like, I'll never know why you saved me. Well, we do know why God saved us. Like, it's wonderful, but let's speak truth. Like, we do know why God saved us. For his glory and for our joy as we spread the glory of God through proclamation. Isn't that what this verse says? Like, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. In other words, you are now a Christian, that you may proclaim. It's right there. This is your purpose. So if we're going to be holy and godly amid all of the pain and suffering in this world, we must remember our job, our mission. We were saved to spread the glory of God, and we do it with our words. We also do it with our actions. We learn about this in chapter 2 through chapter 4, but notice what I said. We spread the glory of God through our words and our actions. I didn't say or. Some people think, oh, I proclaim the gospel with my words and not my actions. That's wrong. That's naive or demonic. At best, it's naive. At worst, it's demonic. Have you ever heard some people, this is more popular, I proclaim the gospel with my life. Have you shared the gospel? Never. At best, naive. At most, demonic. You can't share the gospel just with your hands. It takes both your words and your life. And that's what Peter describes to us. We proclaim the excellencies of God, and we spread the glory of God through our actions. So gospel living is very specific. The way we spread the gospel as we relate to one another in the book of 1 Peter is by loving one another deeply. When we love one another honestly and purely, so that we submit to our authorities and we lead like Christ, We serve one another with the gifts God's given us. We show hospitality to one another. When we act like this, church family, we're loving one another and living missionally. But our missional living is also directed to outsiders. Throughout the book of 1 Peter, we saw over and over again that we evangelize outsiders as we do good, even when they hurt us. When we do good, when other people make fun of you and say, I don't want to be your friend anymore, when people take your property, when living for Jesus costs you something and you don't retaliate, you are living missionally. What about when you do retaliate? And what are some common ways we retaliate? We yell at non-Christians. We make fun of homosexuals. We complain about our culture. On social media, we complain and we yell at Sacramento. Like when we act like that, like we're not doing good. Like, did Jesus do that? Is that how Jesus acted? Like, I thought Jesus said, just give to Caesar what's Caesar's, right? He wasn't complaining about the Roman government, although there was a lot to complain about. He wasn't yelling at sinners. He was inviting them to himself. I mean, for a moment, when I preach Sodom and Gomorrah, let's think about something really important. When God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham knew what was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sexual perversion, homosexuality, rape, injustice. He knew all of that. And when God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to destroy them, what did Abraham say? Yeah! It's about time! He didn't say that. He didn't say to God, yeah, those bunch of homosexuals, those rapists, those racists, those injustice people oppressing the poor. He didn't do any of that. What did Abraham do? He pleaded on behalf of them that God would show them mercy. And yet, I look often on Facebook and on social media, and I see Christians making fun of this world, yelling at non-Christians and complaining about the culture. And that's not missional living. That's unmissional living. That's a de-evangelism. That's not evangelism. What has Peter told us? And his government is oppressive. His government is oppressing the people. And what did Peter say to us? To do good and trust God even when they hurt us. Listen, when we complain and we yell and we are cussing at this world and we say things like, let's go Brandon and things like that, we're acting like losers. You're not a loser. Losers complain. So my favorite team's Everton. You guys know that. My wife calls them Neverton. It's not looking good for Everton. God, please let Everton not get relegated. That's just between me and God. Like if Everton gets relegated, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to complain. I'm going to be a little angry. I might yell like next week when they get relegated, and it's going to happen during this sermon. Like I'm going to be preaching, and my phone will go off, and it says either Everton is safe or Everton's going to get relegated, but Jesus is better than Everton, right? But the point of what I'm saying is this, right? Like if I lose with Everton, I'm going to complain. And I'm going to yell about all the bad calls we received. And I'm going to complain. I might be kind of angry. Why? Because I'm a loser. But if Everton doesn't get relegated and it's Leeds United and Leicester, am I going to be complaining? No. Am I going to be yelling? No. All those bad calls we received, I won't even talk about them because it doesn't matter. Do you hear it? Do you see why that's important for you? You're not a loser. Like, you win. You win. And that frees us up now to be a kind of people who hold on to truth while doing good. That's what we're called to do. We have an identity and we have a mission. And if we're going to be a people who are godly and holy amid our trials, we have to remember both of these truths. Third, if we are going to be holy and godly, we have to understand that our Christian life produces suffering. right? There are some types of Christianity who say Christianity precludes suffering. You'll come here and God will take away your suffering. To some extent, yes, but not completely. Yes, the gospel eliminates some suffering now, like the suffering of guilt and condemnation, but some suffering it doesn't eliminate. The elimination of all suffering comes the new heaven and the new earth. In fact, right now, 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19 tell us that your Christian life will produce suffering. So you being a Christian and you living for Jesus is actually going to cause you to suffer in ways that if you rejected Jesus, you wouldn't suffer. So Peter says, don't be surprised when you suffer. When this world hurts you, don't be surprised. And that should make sense because we're Christians. We're Jesus followers. And how did this world treat Jesus? It reviled him. It made fun of him. It abandoned him. It crucified him. It rejected him. And we shouldn't be surprised when the world does the same thing to us. Rather, we should rejoice. We should rejoice because in the moment when we suffer for Jesus, 1 Peter 4 says we share in Jesus' suffering. So let me remind us of a point. We love it when Jesus shares our suffering, right? We stitch on the pillows and we put on our walls that Jesus is with me in my pain. But as a Christian, you have an opportunity to share with Jesus in his suffering. And if you run from that, it proves you and I don't love Jesus. We're just using Jesus. We're just using Jesus to make our lives happy and comfortable. And when it's no longer comfortable, when following Jesus means we have to sacrifice, means we will not be sexually fulfilled, it means we will lose power, it means bad things for us, we leave, that means we never loved Jesus at all. But for those who love Jesus, we get to share in his suffering. And it says in 1 Peter 4 that when that happens, we get to experience the Spirit in new ways. Like if we're going to make it in this world, if we're going to be holy and godly, we can't be surprised when we suffer. We can't. But we also shouldn't be surprised of the fourth truth that Peter repeated over and over again. Our Christian life produces present suffering, but it also produces future glory. So important, guys. Like the actual suffering that you go through, like when people don't treat you well and you're sad. When you share the gospel even though you're scared to. When somebody says, you believe that? Well, I don't want to be your friend anymore. And you say, I do believe that. And they're no longer your friend. Like when you're not sexually fulfilled because you're either not married or you have same-sex attraction or in your marriage you're not being sexually fulfilled. But you're going to be pure for the glory of God. Like all that suffering, like any ounce of suffering in the path of obedience. Like that's what I'm trying to say. Like anytime you suffer because you're obeying God, that suffering is producing for you eternal glory. That's the way it works. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians, that our suffering is producing for us eternal glory. Peter said it everywhere. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through 7, he told us, and at the very end of the book, he told us this. Your present suffering is producing future glory. And let's just put a footnote to the sermon. When I'm preaching, I'm trying to change you through content. I'm trying to teach you things. Like right now, I'm trying to teach us that our life, when we suffer, that suffering produces glory. Present suffering produces future glory. I want to teach you that, and I want it to sink into your heart. But I also want to teach you how to read the Bible. So notice, Peter began his entire letter in verse 6 through 7 that says, you are suffering, and it's producing for you glory. You could write it down. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through 7. And then he ended the letter by talking about how after you've suffered a little while, you will experience glory. So here's the tip. When an author begins a letter one way and he ends with it that way, that's a major idea. And everything in between needs to be interpreted through those truths. So everything that we've learned in 1 Peter has to be interpreted through the truths that your present suffering produces future glory. It's important, guys. Like, this world wants you to be nearsighted, right? Like, it wants you to get your eyes off of eternity. It wants you to focus right now. And when you're in that state, you are ripe for the devil's devouring work. Like, when you're not thinking that you're going to live forever with God, you're going to be devoured. So, for example, if you're just looking at spending your money on earthly treasures, houses at the beach and houses in the mountains and fast cars, and you're just looking at earthly treasures, you're going to use your money to buy earthly treasures. But if you're thinking about how you're going to live forever with God and experience oceanfront views way better in this world and mountains way better in this world, that Laguna Beach and Dana Point and the Sierra Nevadas have nothing on eternity, then you're going to spend your money to get as many people there as you can. Do you see? Like, what we're thinking about is going to affect us completely. You're going to live forever with God. And if you forget that, you will not make it. We have to be people who leave this church remembering that truth. And finally, theology helps us. You know, there are some churches who are like, we need more practical stuff, not more theology. Man, that's so dumb. I don't think that's a bad word. I really hope it's not a bad word. If somebody thinks it's a bad word, you could tell me and I'll confess that sin next week. It's not correct, guys. Like, theology matters. Let me show it to you. Let me prove it to you. If I thought my wife didn't love me, would that affect the way I practically live? Answer the question. If I thought my wife didn't love me, would it affect me practically? What if I knew my wife loved me? Would that affect me practically? Do you see knowledge? Knowledge about our relationship is going to affect our relationship? It's the same way with God. Knowledge of God affects your relationship with God. If you think God is this harsh taskmaster who just wants you to perform, you're going to be very discouraged. On the one hand, you might be very proud because you're performing well and you're very arrogant. And then you look down on other people and you're like, oh, I'm way better than that person. But then if you're honest about yourself, if God's this big performer checker, you won't just be arrogant, you'll be severely depressed because you'll know you don't perform well. What if you believed God only controlled the good things that happened to you, but the bad things he wasn't in control? What would happen to you when you suffered? You would be terrified because God couldn't help you. But if you knew God controlled the good things in your life and the bad things in your life, and you really believed that God was working all things out for good, then you would have boldness even amid your pain. Do you see? Everybody has a theology. Everybody does. There's no church that has no theology. There ain't it out there. You all have a theology. We need to make sure our theology is biblical. Theology is the study of God. Who is God? And it's so important to us. So at the end of the letter, in verses 6 through 11, Peter kind of removes the curtains, and he talks about the devil for the first time. And what he's doing is he's saying, guys, like, your suffering isn't just an earthly ordeal. You have an enemy who wants to devour you. He's not content with eating your foot as a snack. He's not content with nibbling off your arm, amputating your arm, but then he's going to let you go to heaven. No, he wants to devour you. He hates you. That's what he told us at the end of the letter. But notice something. And now we're going to apply the principle of interpretation that I just taught you. So look back at verse 6 through 11. It's a section in 1 Peter, and notice how it begins. It says in verse 7, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. In verse 6 through 11, Peter's ending the letter by saying, God cares for you. And then he ends it by saying, and the God of all grace, Our God is gracious. So the way you need to interpret your suffering, the way I need to interpret my pain and my suffering, yes, is that we have an enemy who hates us. Absolutely. But the way we interpret that begins with the doctrine of God and it ends with the doctrine of God. Peter says, God cares for you. You have an enemy who hates you. God is gracious to you. Theology helps us. How are you going to be a people who perseveres amid pain? It's theology. You have to be thinking right about God. And the good news is that he cares for you and he's gracious to you. Theology is what's going to help us, guys. And that's what's going to transform our life. So let's return back to the reflection question in these last couple minutes. What change has or should happen in your life because of this sermon series? It's an individual question. I've been thinking about this as a corporate question. Like, what should change in our church because of this sermon series? And let me just tell you what I really think. We need to grow in our ability to share one another's spiritual burdens. I want that to be the big takeaway. We need to grow in our ability as a church to carry one another's spiritual burdens. We should carry one another's physical burdens, absolutely. But it's alarming to me that nobody on our prayer app is saying, I'm depressed, will you pray for me? I'm having suicidal thoughts, will you pray for me? I feel so condemned because of past sin, and I don't know what to do with it. I'm having anger problems. I just come home and I'm angry, and I'm not there for my family because I'm angry. Like, that's happening here. I'm a single mom, and I feel so alone and forgotten. Like, we're not doing that. I mean, like, it's happening, but it needs to be happening a lot more. And if we're going to persevere as God's people amid present pain, we need one another to carry one another's physical burdens, but the end game isn't merely physical. The end game is spiritual. So we need to be carrying one another's spiritual burdens. So that's how I've been convicted, and it's going to continue to shape my preaching and my ministry, that we become a church where we carry one another's spiritual burdens. But now this is an individual question that I want you all to ask yourself. We're going to have a time of reflection and a time of invitation where I'm going to ask Mike to come back up, and Marisa to come back up. And we're going to spend a few moments thinking about this question. And then at some point, Mike is going to ask you all to stand and sing that final song. And that's when we're going to corporately respond together. But before you respond as a corporate body, let's respond individually. I'm going to give you some moments right now in silence, and then Mike's going to play to answer this question. What needs to change in your life because of this sermon series? Let's reflect, church family.